I joined the Greens in 1990, but the Greens in the United States were in sort of a period of transition. I'm not going to go into a full history of the party, but there were a number of different national formations, and there were some struggles, and some of those were quite unpleasant. And in terms of my own relationship to some of those, I was part of sort of a coalition that we called the Rundis. So we are the realist fundies. We believed in sort of the radical promise of the Greens, but we also wanted to get things done. And we weren't very interested in the divisiveness of some of the politics within the Greens. And I think part of the reason why we had growth in the early 2000s was that that vision of a united party won out, right? Despite some of the difficulties that we had. But I wasn't just a Green, and I never have been, just like probably most of you. I put most of my time and energy in terms of social work, social change work into other things. Throughout the 1990s, I was very involved in the Earth First movement, radical environmental movement. We hosted the Round River Rendezvous, the international gathering of the Earth First movement in northern Wisconsin in '97 as part of the anti-mining struggle. I was involved with the student movement. We organized teach-ins on hundreds of campuses over many years on the corporatization of education, questions of corporate power, corporate personhood. I did a lot of work with the labor movement, farm labor organizing, just like a lot of people who are getting involved or in the early stages of their activism. I tried a lot of different things. I say to my students when I'm teaching about social movements, I say that activists who commit, who decide that they're lifers, who are going to stick with it, tend to put themselves on a path of self-pedagogy, of self-teaching, and I was doing that, right? So for myself, out of that process, I came to the conclusion by the late 1990s that I really needed to focus on building a democracy movement in the United States. And that's essentially what I've, the lion's share of my work, including my work within the Greens, has been devoted to that, to building a movement that not only practices democracy, but seeks democratization as its goal, democracy as an end, not just as a means. And so, there were a lot of sort of steps along the way. Kirit mentioned the Seattle uprising in 1999. We had the Florida recount fight. The Green Party, by the way, played an important role in that in Florida, mobilizing immediately with Medea Benjamin and others to turn people out, to support making sure that every vote was counted, that we stood with the Congressional Black Caucus, even when Al Gore didn't. There's a lot of sort of stories along the way that I could share about those years. But I just sort of want to emphasize again that it's not just the Greens, it's not just the party, but it's being a Green within a larger movement. We all do that. I had some of that history there as well, and some of the images you see there are from the People's Climate Convergence and People's Climate March in 2013, where it says "Converge for System Change." There's a couple of images from Seattle. There's the press conference we held. That's George Friday, North Carolina, who is also a Green, I believe. We're there with Congressman Rick Nolan introducing the We the People Act at the National Press Club right across the river there in DC. There's a picture from the Wisconsin uprising in 2011. So and there's a lot of other sort of background there that I could talk about if you want to. In terms of myself, just in terms of the last 20 years, I've held a lot of different roles. I've actually only run for office twice. I ran in '96 for a county board and won the primary. And then we had a recount in the general election, in which I lost by 6 votes. So it was very close. And then I ran in 2010 for the Wisconsin State Assembly. It was a 4-party race. And we were pretty effective in terms of building Green strength. So I didn't win, but I got a third of the vote, came in second. The Republican came in third place. I think the biggest win in that election was that by election day, the entire Democratic establishment had backed me over their own nominee. It was a little too late because of sort of the number of votes that had already been cast, and also the way in which ballots were counted. We had straight ticket voting back then. They don't have that in Wisconsin anymore. But we were able to really shift a lot of people, get endorsements from the teachers union, the firefighters, from other unions, from sort of, and really create a space that was useful in sort of the years that followed. So anyway, this is where I'm not going to go through all that history either, but I just want to say, I've played a role that's been more prominent as a candidate or as a campaign manager, but I've also done a lot of work behind the scenes, just as you all have, working on literally hundreds of local elections, doing door-to-door phone banking, lit design, database management, all the nitty-gritty work that you have to do. And I'm proud to say that my hometown is the city that has elected the most Greens to office in the United States. I think it's probably about 15% of the Green elected officials were in Madison, Wisconsin. We had at various points the president of the city council, president of the school board, county board chair. We've had candidates who, did better than the incumbent mayor, for example, at one point. So Bert Zipperer came in third place and knocked the incumbent Democratic mayor into fourth place. We've had some wins like that too. I think it bears taking some lessons from sort of the deep organizing work that went on in terms of being able to not only get people elected, but to advance policy like, the municipal minimum wage ordinances, which we did. We saw that Santa Monica had been one of the first to pass a municipal minimum wage, if not the first, with a Green mayor there. Mike Feinstein got a hold of our elected officials in Wisconsin. They introduced it there in Madison, Racine, Milwaukee, Stevens Point, Oshkosh, advanced immigrant voting rights, worked on sick leave policies. We're really 15, 20 years ahead of the curve in terms of advancing policy. So this is just broadly speaking, the perspective from which I come to addressing the question of the future. That's my past with the Greens in very broad strokes, right? The question that I really want to focus on today is, what is our theory of change, right? I think that there are a number of competing theories of change that have been operating within the Green Party since at least the late 1990s, and that are still sort of overlapping. They are coexisting, but they're in tension with each other. And I want to raise these up and see what kind of discussion we get going. So first of all, is the Green Party, is our primary purpose to serve as a structure for political independence? Is our purpose to win national state power and use the federal government to transform society? Or are we seeking to transform our society from the grassroots up? Or is it some combination of these things or something else? Okay. So let's look at the question of the Greens as a structure for political independence. So I've often said, other Greens have often said, probably some of the people here have said, that the purpose of independent politics is to help social movements speak in their own voice. What we have in the United States, because we have establishment parties, is that we have social movement organizations that have investments in the continued success of one party or the other. And let's be frank, in the last 20 years, that has meant the Democratic Party for any progressive movement. There were still some moderate and liberal Republicans in Wisconsin when I was coming up, a few of them, but that day is long since gone. So what that's meant is, for people's movements in the United States, the organizations that are so vital to the success of popular movements tend to have strong relationships with Democrats. And that means that they tend to spend a lot of time protecting Democrats. And that can and does compromise the ability of those organizations, and therefore those movements, to make demands and to sort of act independently. So a function of the Green Party could be understood to be to provide a structure that allows social movements to break for the Democrats. And just, I have pictures here from our really wonderful Green contingent at the Free Trade Area of the America protests in 2003. I was co-chair of the party then. We had hundreds of Greens with green flags. We were very visible there. And actually, we're working in coalition with Greens from throughout the Americas in mobilizing against the FTAA. But of course, the FTAA was something that was supported by many Democrats in Congress. and continued to be. And so it's arguable that the Green Party, being at a point where we were relatively strong in those years, created a space for labor unions, for farmers organizations, for youth groups, for environmental justice organizations to say to the Democratic Party, we have an alternative. We have somewhere to go. Similarly, I mentioned my assembly race in 2010. That same coalition that came together to back me in my assembly race was the coalition that led the Wisconsin uprising. It was the Madison teachers, it was the Teaching Assistants Association, it was the firefighters, and it was the independent sort of social movement organizations that had backed me in my race, and the left wing of the Democratic Party that had come over to back me in my race against the Democratic nominee, that also provided the leadership in the Wisconsin uprising, and that resisted demobilization, resisted pressure from the Obama White House to end the Wisconsin uprising, right? So that's one sort of theory of change for the Greens. The Greens are here to create that space. Social movements are what is most important, and we have a role to play in that respect. Another theory of change is that we're trying to put Greens in the White House, right? We're actually building a real independent political party that not only competes at the local and increasingly state level, but is attempting to win national power, right? And of course, the Greens have won national power or parts of national power in a number of countries around the world, in a limited sense in Mexico and Brazil, in Ireland, they've been part of governing coalitions, in Denmark, Iceland, there's been a Green head of state. The Greens were part of Syriza in Greece. The Greens, of course, are vying for to become the #1 party in Germany right now. So this would be the analog to that the Green Party in the United States would take on that kind of a role, and that what we're really trying to do is win the presidency, win seats in Congress, and then implement our policies, implement the Green New Deal, the Green New Deal, the original Green New Deal, right? Impose 80% reductions in military spending, if not more, right? Et cetera. I would say, this is an interesting theory of change, because I would be willing to bet you that you will find few Greens that will actually embrace it, right? Will actually say, this is what we're trying to do, right? Yet in practice, if you look at what we've done over the last 24 years, this has been a major part of our activity, right? We have acted as if this is part of our theory of change, right? And I've certainly been a part of that. And I'll say there are very good reasons for Greens and for anybody trying to build an independent progressive political party to focus on federal elections, and in terms of getting visibility, which then in turn can translate to wins down ticket, right, in the following election cycles. If you look at the history of Green growth, the party has grown the most in terms of the number of members, in terms of the number of elected officials, in terms of the number of people running for office in the years following our stronger presidential runs. Okay, so that has been the case. And when the Green Party has not had a strong presidential run, in other words, 2004 and 2008, you saw declines follow in Green Party membership, number of elected officials, and also number of candidates running for office. So there are arguments to be made for this, but those are arguments, I will point out, that don't actually center around the idea that there will be a Green who's elected to the White House. Okay, we'll come back to this. This is a second theory of change. A third is the idea that the Greens should think of themselves as a party of community-led social transformation. So basically the idea of transforming our society from the grassroots up. And this should be familiar, because this is really sort of where the origins of the Greens in Europe and also in the United States were. If you were to have attended a Green gathering in the US in the late 1980s, this sort of idea of building a sort of networks of green communities, building bioregionally, et cetera, was pretty much where the energy was. And I would argue that Greens today in this country and elsewhere still sort of embrace this theory of change. Still put a lot of energy into it. So we saw post 2016, and I think we're seeing now post 2020 efforts by our presidential nominees and the National Party to bring attention to local candidates, to really channel funds and support and volunteers to local campaigns where the prospects for winning and winning something significant are seem most apparent, right? So I have Jake Tonkel and Franca Muller-Paz, from Baltimore and San Jose, from the most recent election year last year. We've also seen Greens engage in what's sometimes called municipal foreign policy or municipal civil disobedience, et cetera, where you've seen Green elected officials and Green locals work with social movement organizations to build sort of a counterpower to federal policies. We've seen that on in resisting ICE raids and the building of the sanctuary cities movement, and so on. And then there have been a number of efforts in this country, although I don't know of any recently, but there were a number some time ago, and there's certainly many that are ongoing around the world to build ties among Green locals and among Green elected officials so that people can share policy ideas, build ties, et cetera, right? So that would be the third general theory of change that I think has been operative here in the States in my time in the Green Party. So where does that leave us? Well, first of all, the Greens in the US do have our origins in part in inspiration from Green parties overseas, right? And I want to speak about those in a second. But I also just want to note that we also have our origins in social movements in the United States too. So I mentioned the treaty rights struggle, the anti-mining movements of the 1980s and 1990s, but of course, there's a long history of independent progressive politics in this country. I think there's good reasons why the Greens took hold in Wisconsin first, or that was one of the places where Greens took hold earliest. There was already something called the Labor Farm Party, which was an outgrowth of something that was called the Wisconsin Progressive Alliance in the 1970s. And that in turn had its origins in the Wisconsin Progressive Party. So there's direct lineages in terms of independent politics that we should recognize. We're not just a copycat of the German Greens and so on, and then reacting to them. In 2004, when the Green National Convention happened in Milwaukee, when we hosted it there, the last socialist party mayor of Milwaukee was the honorary chair for that convention, right? So there's some direct lineages in terms of independent politics on the left, and also in terms of social movement organizing that have to do with the politics of this country. But we are, of course, part of a global Green network. And I think it's helpful for us to think about what's similar and what's different about the conditions under which Green organizing has taken place in the US versus other countries. So Die Grünen, the German Greens, of course, were started with the idea of being a movement party. That's to say a different kind of political party, not just a political party, but really a party that is an expression of social movements. And so there you see a picture of Petra Kelly in the top left corner, just in really representing sort of the radical edge and leadership of the Die Grünen in the 80s into the early 90s, as she was entering the Bundestag. Arguably, the German Greens have become a party movement, right? They're a party first, movement second. They still have a movement expression to them. They're engaged in supporting social movements. They have ties to social movements, but they are above all a political party. And what has changed with the German, I think what allowed that change to happen is that, of course, they have a different political system than we do. I remember in 2000, must have been 2010, was invited by the German Greens to attend their national meeting in Baden-Württemberg in Freiburg. And I remember sitting down with some Green politicians, and the first thing they said was, "We want to thank you, Americans, for writing our Constitution for us." Right? Well, the much more democratic Constitution that Germany has, that was in part drafted by American lawyers post World War II, allowed the Greens to enter national politics. Right? They have proportional representation, public financing, et cetera. Right? If we look back at the U.S. experience, I think after 30 years for me, and maybe going close to 40 years for the Green experiment in the United States, there's a question of whether a movement party is really possible in the United States. Is it possible, at least in terms of national elections, for the Green Party to sort of in this country follow the path that has been followed in many other countries that have more democratic systems of elections? And if it is possible, how is it possible, and what forms must it take? How are we different? And for myself, I think that we've got to figure out these theories of change and figure out how they relate to each other, and make some decisions about strategy moving forward. We have to look back to the last 30 to 40 years and say, where does it make sense for us to put our energies, and where should we not put our energies? So I just have some thoughts on this, and I'll just say, I am in a strange place because I remain a member of the Green Party. I'm committed to the Greens and so on, but I haven't been an officer of the party for a long time, and my role is mostly in terms of Green politics, has been mostly in talking with various people, at times. Jill will call me up and ask for advice at some points, usually Jill Stein on very short notice. I talk to Howie Hawkins and David Cobb and other folks who go back. I'm happy to talk with you guys, right? So that's my role, but I'm not on the national listservs. I'm not active in any party local. I wasn't in California when I was there. And so you're welcome to take a look at what I say and tell me that I'm out of touch, and feel free to do that, or let's have a conversation about it. So this is where I'll end, and then I guess we'll have some time to talk, which is good. So I've been thinking more and more that the Greens in the U.S. need to go back to the future. Right? We need to go back to the politics of the late 80s and early 90s, not entirely. We've learned a lot of things since then, but really the focus of the Green movement in the late 80s and early 90s was on the locals, was on local elections to a certain extent, was on local assemblies, was on policy, was on movement culture. The Greens were fully in the late 1980s, with a few exceptions, in places like Wisconsin and Maine and California, where we had elected officials. We were really a movement. And barely a party, right? And I'm not advocating that the Greens abandon electoral politics at all, but I am advocating that we think about what Green politics are really all about. What is the world we're trying to create, right? So I think that the focus for Greens is people who really believe in community power and direct democracy and localism, in decentralization, in feminism, in nonviolence. The focus should be on building up community democracy at the local level. That means doing whatever we can to strengthen municipal home rule, wherever we can, to bring into being home rule in states that don't have it, so that when local communities take on a major corporation or want to engage in some progressive, innovative form of policymaking, they have the autonomy to do that. When I mentioned the municipal minimum wage ordinances in Wisconsin, we passed those, and then the Democratic governor cut a deal with the Republican legislature and signed into law a bill preempting municipal minimum wage laws, right? Basically shutting down that avenue for change. And there's a real struggle that's been going on since the 1990s in this country between progressive localities and less progressive federal courts, state legislatures, and of course, Congress and federal apparatus. And So let's recognize that that we really need to strengthen the institutions of local governance that that really are closest to the people, and that that Greens have had the most success with. You know, where Greens have really made a difference in terms of policy, it's been on not only sort of municipal policies like that, but also leading the way in opposing the Iraq and Afghanistan invasions by organizing at the local level, by putting immediate withdrawal from Iraq and Afghanistan on the ballot in municipalities all across the country. Those were Greens who led that fight. And when it was city councils that passed the first Anti-Patriot Act legislation, those resolutions were sponsored by Green elected officials, right? So this is what Greens have already done. And since that's been effective in terms of advancing Green politics, then it makes sense for Greens to advocate for strengthening community power, community democracy, home rule, et cetera. To the extent that Greens engage in state elections, it should be about building community power and democracy. So if a Green runs for the state legislature, and by the way, far too few Greens run for the state legislature. It's crazy that year after year, we have more Greens running for federal offices in many states, if not most states, than the Greens do for state offices. There are many parts of the country in which the Greens are the natural second party or first party, right? In which the Republican Party is the natural third party. Most of California is like that, right? So to the extent that there's a focus on higher level elections, it's those state legislative races that make sense in terms of being able to get wins. But what do our candidates do, or what do Green candidates do when they're running? I mean, they should be advocating for this community democracy politics, this green cities politics, this green communities politics, and making clear that that's really what the Green vision is all about, right? It's about building democracy where people live, eat, play, pray, where we do our thing, right? And it's not about winning power for ourselves. Federal elections, similarly, the primary goal, I think, for running in any federal race should be to bring attention to the Green communities sort of politics that the Green Party came out of here in the United States. And I think that we frankly invest way too much energy in federal races. I think the presidential race, I don't have a position on that. I have it mainly because I haven't been able to settle on it. I see the value of the presidential campaigns, as I said, in terms of ballot access, but even more so in terms of sort of drawing attention to the Greens and the Green vision and the Green policies. I mean, look, in 2012, we took up the Green New Deal package that had been introduced in 2010 through the Coordinated Campaign Committee, Howie Hawkins. I also ran on the Green New Deal in 2010. We took it up and we said a measure of success for the Stein-Honkala campaign will be if we have put the Green New Deal on the national map. And if you look at the national TV ads that we ran, we were the only campaign to run a national TV ad campaign. If you look at all of our signage and buttons and everything that we put out there, it was all about a Green New Deal for America. And that was very much central to our campaign. So I would say, yes, we succeeded in putting the Green New Deal into the minds of many people. I haven't seen any interviews in which Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was asked who she voted for in 2012, but I would be willing to bet you that it wasn't Barack Obama. And I know that her campaign team were not Democrats either at that time. So yes, there's some role for presidential politics, but there's also a lot of drawbacks. You know, right now I know there's a lot of consternation over HR 1, the sort of this omnibus package pushing a whole series of election and voting reforms, most of which are very good. Having been somebody who was responsible for helping us to get federal matching funds for the first time as Jill Stein's campaign manager in 2012, it was the first time that a Green nominee had done it, right? Somebody who was actually a Green Party member. So it was the first time we had done it on our own without sort of the stature that Ralph Nader brought and the networks that he brought to us. I've always wondered whether it was really worth it. Not only because it's useful to achieve federal matching funds in terms of sort of the party building activities that go on. So having those thresholds, you can think of them as targets. People work hard, they raise the money, and it's very useful in terms of building organization at the state level. And that was great. The amount of scrutiny that a campaign goes through for those funds, which are pretty limited in terms of the amount of funding we're talking about. I would never want to go through that again. And Jill Stein is still dealing with the FEC harassing her from the 2016 race. The major parties don't have to deal with that level of scrutiny. Only the Green Party had to deal with that scrutiny because we're the ones who were doing it cleanly. We were the ones who submitted ourselves to that scrutiny. So again, maybe we'll have a conversation about presidential campaigns, but I really, regardless of where you come down on that, I really think that the emphasis needs to be on the community politics, the community program of the Greens. And then finally, to the extent that we do have a larger vision, if there's something that can take the place of a presidential campaign in terms of young folks coming out and seeing the Green Party, seeing the value of the Green Party, seeing the difference that green politics offers, I think it has to be at the level of the global. Right? We are a global movement and a global party. The Greens have led on putting forward the politics of the global Green New Deal. The Greens have been at the forefront of the global anti-war movement throughout my lifetime. And so, we need to not only articulate a vision for federating green communities, but also a global constitutional vision. What does a green world actually look like? How do we deal with the climate crisis and govern our global economy in a way that will allow us to transition as rapidly as we must to a climate safe political economy, right? So I guess it does in the end mean that we need to go back to the future in terms of where my thinking is at this point after everything I've been through at all levels. And we need to build the local, and we need to build the global, and we need to stop paying quite so much attention to the national. I'll stop there.
Okay, I think we have probably lots of questions. I know that Tina, I don't see Tina here, but okay. And Kira, do you want to handle the question? Diane. Okay, why don't you ask your question?
Let me, Diane?
Go ahead.
So I just want to let everybody know how we have quite a few people on the call. So we'd like to recognize people who want to state their question first. If you want to put your question in the chat, we can come to it. So go ahead, Tina, and then if you have a question, put it in the chat and we'll unmute you.
Yes. My question is, how do we draw grassroots activists into the Green Party that are now captured by the NGO industrial complex that's funded by oligarch foundations?
I mean, it's a great question. I think my position on that has been that you do that first by building capacity. So you have to have an alternative. You have to have something appealing that people want to be part of. And just criticizing is not enough, although the criticisms are important, because otherwise, if nobody hears them, then they don't learn that there's an alternative, right? So we have to while we're posing those criticisms, we have to create spaces that are welcoming and that are functional, right? And that's kind of a tricky thing. Greens can be both very sort of accepting, with the belief in democracy and the practice of democracy means that Greens tend to be fairly tolerant of a lot of things. But at the same time, we also need to get things done. and not getting things done can really lead to burnout. Because look, there are very few rewards to being an active Green, right? It's not a good career path. I was a Democrat until I joined the Green Party in 1990. If I had stayed in the Democratic Party, I'd probably be in Congress right now. I mean, I was an active Democrat, and I still know plenty of people, in the Democratic Party, right? So a lot of people, they're in a position where they say, well, if I'm with the Green Party, it's a dead end in terms of a career and being able to do things. Even if you're a good person, you still want to have the power to do things. So we don't have that to offer them. We don't have jobs to offer them. So if we want people to stay with us, well, we at least better get things done, right? So I guess I could talk more about capacity building, but the first thing is that we have to have an alternative that is viable and that is attractive and that is supportive, and that sometimes that means not putting up with a lot of craziness either, right? So for example, our Green Party local, this is a sad story, but our Green Party local had a real hardship when somebody who was dealing with some mental health problems, who had not been to a party meeting in years, showed up and stabbed somebody at our mailing party at the library. We had 25 people for a mailing party. It's good, good turnout. Some of us had said that really this person shouldn't have been sort of welcomed back, and others had encouraged them to show up. And our party sort of membership dropped pretty radically, right? After that, it was just such a bad experience. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, and we had to rebuild that over a number of years. What I'm trying to say is that we need to be effective, right? And sometimes being effective means also not putting up with a lot of things that we do put up with, like Roseanne Barr, for example. I mean, it's just like, let's be serious. Young people want to make some changes. They need to know that their time is going to be valued, their energy is going to be valued, and older folks too. The other thing is that at the same time that we recognize that there is a real problem with the capture of major social movement organizations by funders and also just the structural realities of the Democratic Party, right? We need to be careful to not alienate organizations and unions that may actually be open to us, and we need to, Greens should be deliberate about finding the opportunities to build alliances, to show that the Greens have something to offer. One practice that we had in Madison, and I know is a practice in some other parts of the country, is that we had Greens who were delegates to the AFL-CIO Labor Council, right? And there was a Green whip, so to speak, a nonviolent whip, whose job it was to organize the votes of the Greens and the independent left delegates to the Regional Labor Council. Because we had fights with, for example, the building trades over environmental policy and immigrant rights and other things like that, right? So all I would say then is just don't write off social movement organizations, right? And really be ready to pursue alliances wherever they can be built. That's my response.
Okay, Lou Novak, did you want to ask your question?
Sure. Ben, thanks for this presentation today and all your contributions to the Green Party. I'm interested in point number 4, in particular, that reference to global constitutionalism. Is there a particular structure or organization you're referring to, or some potential direction for some global such at a global scale? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm really glad you raised that. I am just old enough to have been around when there were still active chapters of the World Federalist, in my hometown. There historically, of course, have been projects, global constitutionalist projects that envision something much better than the United Nations, right? And that the last time in my read of history that there was a sort of a major upsurge in terms of a vision for a new democratic global system of governance was in the years following World War II. Returning GIs, people who had gone through the horrors of that period of the late 30s and into the 40s, who said, we cannot allow global elites and national elites, especially at that time, to take us down this path again, right? And then I think the politics of world federalism, faded quite a bit. And what I see happening now is I see some emergent social movement forms that suggest the possibility of a new global constitutionalism from below. And I'm not the only one. There are scholars of this new constitutionalism all over the world. So there's sociologists and legal scholars and others who are paying attention to things like the World Social Forum, like the International Peace Movement, like the global climate strikes and the calls for climate democracy, like the Global Greens and the Progressive International, and so on. I don't know, just to directly answer your question, I don't know of a specific proposal or a specific program that has widespread support, but what I see are lots of things that tend in that direction right now. And I would suggest that since the Greens have always been a global party that in many ways prefigured the global turn of US politics and world politics in the late 90s, and throughout the 90s into the 2000s, that we should take it upon ourselves in the States and as part of this global green movement to articulate a process for constituting a new system of governing this planet. Because the system we have right now is not democratic and it's destroying the planet and we can't survive it. So I think the possibility is here now. It was a great question.
All right, do we have somebody raise their hand? Or there was a question in the chat that we go to while we're waiting. It was about a national plan for MMP/STV. Did you want to take that one, Ben?
So this is where I'll show some ignorance. MMP is multi-member
Proportional.
proportional representation. Gotcha. I mean, look.
Jesse, you can go and ask it. I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Jesse.
Sure. Well, essentially, because of thresholds with first past the post, it's not possible for Greens to get elected in most districts. You have to win 50% or more. And so they're trying to go up against a system that's designed to make you fail. And my feeling is that if the Green Party organized around a democracy concept that the Democrats and the Republicans are not going to take up, that it'd be possible to rally people who are not Greens around a process that will help Greens and every other minor party. So it's crazy to put energy into something that is going to fail.
Yeah.
And you want to put energy into things that are going to succeed. The lower the hurdle is, the easier it is to jump. And the lower hurdles are local governments that are not democratic. So by conducting ballot initiative campaigns at the local level, Green parties could organize around a concept and a process that will help them succeed in the future, plus will gather energy into the party.
Yeah.
So my feeling, I tried this locally. I live in Boulder, Colorado, and essentially I didn't meet with any success. I was, I'll confess, I'm a registered Democrat, but I lean toward to the Green Party.
Yes.
But when Democrats win between 71 and 75% of the vote in my county, it's kind of futile to go with a group of people who have no chance of success. So I've tried to lobby inside of the Democratic Party. I got proportional representation into the Democratic Party platform at the local level. But I can't get Greens to help me work on a system that will enable the future success for the Green Party. And I think that you want to put all of your limited resources into something that's going to help you succeed. And instead, what I find is that Greens tend to be all over the map. They spread their energy around. They don't focus on any one project, and so they don't get anything accomplished.
Yeah. Well, let me sort of agree with you and disagree with you. So the fact that we know what ranked choice voting is, and that the New York Times is editorialized.
Don't use ranked choice voting. That's instant runoff voting.
Let me just finish up here. The reason why those reforms have actually moved forward, right, is because Greens formed the Center for Voting and Democracy in the 1990s, which is now called Fair Vote. And if you look at the places where IRV and RCV have moved forward, it's been places where the Greens were strongest, right? So we have it at the state level for most elections in Maine, right? We have it in city elections in the Twin Cities and San Francisco. And so there's been, so all I want to say is that to the extent that there's been progress, and there has been progress, although it's taken a long time, it's in part because Greens have been doing the work on the movement side and have been building coalitions in many cases with people who are active in the Democratic Party, right? And in other parties in some places, right? Alaska, et cetera. And so that, so I want to acknowledge that, okay? And then I also just want to raise a point. I agree with you very much, Jesse, that there's a need to really focus energies. But that oftentimes the energies are dispersed. But there are many elections in which Greens can win even with the existing system, right? And we know that because Greens have won pluralities and sometimes majorities and sometimes supermajorities in those elections. And so, the question becomes, how do we ensure that there is a strategy that focuses energies on the winnable races and that ties those wins to movement building processes beyond the Green Party? And I see that there's some other comments there too.
Why don't we recognize Jackie Dano? You mentioned Maine. We have great attendance today. Somebody from Maine, Jackie, did you want to get?
Yeah, I'd like to. Hi everyone. I have to get off on this wonderful in the work thing that's going on right now. It's starting at 4 that I have to get on to. But I just wanted to say that yes, we got ranked choice voting here in Maine, and we ran a candidate who really was sort of like a Jill Stein candidate, Lisa Savage, who ran an amazing race. But what happened was the Democrats running against her did not acknowledge ranked choice voting. They never talked about ranking themselves. They treated it as if it was still the same, that you had to vote for the Democrat to keep the Republican out. So this has been our biggest problem. It's not our issues. It's not the work that we do. It's all got to do with the two-party system. And until we can get them, even with ranked choice voting, even though we have it, they
And Jackie, they suffered for that, right? I mean, they lost that. They were stupid. They lost that election.
Oh yeah, they lost it. I mean, but
So-
it was the most frustrating thing in the world, Ben, because she
Right.
was fabulous.
She's a great candidate.
And we could have done so much for the state of Maine, which really needs to have a leader like that.
Yes. Yeah.
But
Look,
it was so infuriating. They even kept her out of debates. It was just, but
although she made it into some, look, I can understand the feeling of a lost opportunity and being irritated at the stupidity of the Democratic Party in that case, in terms of how they related to Lisa Savage. But I will point out that Lisa Savage did get a lot of attention nationally. There was a sense of opening. And then beyond that, the Democratic Party is not a monolith, as we all know, right? And so there are some parts of the country, and then there's some parts of Maine where you'll have Democrats who would recognize that that was not strategic on their part, right? And there are other places where they don't have a clue. And because the two-party system operates the way it does, I've argued at various points that it really has hollowed out the Democratic Party for Democrats as well, right? That the Democrats and the Republicans are pillars of the state. And you have all kinds of different sets of interests and people who are sort of forced together. So I would say as Greens, and as a Green, historically, my approach has been, take care, Jackie, thanks for your work. My approach has been to identify the people who are members of other parties and people who are not members of any party who share our agenda for democratization, and to not cut off the possibility for those alliances. And when we do that, that's when we have, I think, growth. When we shut ourselves off, well, we're already being marginalized. So let's not do that any more than we need to.
Can I correct
Jesse,
something?
I think there are maybe other folks here. So
There's this misnomer that keeps being used, which is ranked choice voting. It's instant runoff voting in single member districts. And the problem is single member districts. You can't win unless there are multi-member districts. And people conflate ranking systems with single member districts and think that fixes the problem. It doesn't.
Well, none of this fixes the problem, right? I mean,
Well,
IRB.
actually, single transferable vote would fix the problem.
IRB and STV are both forms of ranked choice voting, and we need proportional representation.
You
and
can't get that.
And let me move beyond that. When I raised the question of running for the presidency, I don't believe in having a president, right? I'm with Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Paine and others.
It should be a parliamentary system.
Yeah, we need a parliamentary system, and we need probably to move beyond that. So there are a lot of reforms we need, and let's.
Yeah. So let's use the right
but
term.
I see that Tina's got their hand up there.
Is that me?
Tina, did you have a question?
I just wanted to comment, and Ben did, mention that ranked choice voting and STV, they're both forms of the same thing. And I did want to highlight what I had posted in the chat, that there is a bill in the House that is introduced every time that's called the Fair Representation Act through
Right.
Fair Vote. Fair Vote is an organization that we can get behind to help support and educate people about the Fair Representation Act, which introduces proportional representation, ranked choice voting, and an end to gerrymandering. So that would be a huge overturn of the system right there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. I'm going to encapsulate some of those questions in the chat. So if we assume people agree with you, the Green Party should not spend so much time in the presidential race, how does it deal with the current rules? Some of the president campaign report, the rules for things regarding our candidates, there's not a lot of rules, and we end up with, because very open about who can run for president and what should we do with that?
So, Kira, I think what your sound was breaking up for me, and I think maybe for others, but it sounded like you were referring to some of the comments about the role the presidential campaign plays because of ballot access rules for allowing people to even run for office. Is that right? As Greens?
Yeah, also, I mean, we're only required to run as a candidate for some states.
Right.
And
Right. So,
how do we deal with, we have to present somebody, and then some of the contenders that we present are don't put the party in best. I mean, some people in the last presidential cycle that were not commentary about the Green Party at all.
Yeah.
So how do we do that, you think?
Okay, I'm not sure I got all of that, but I'll just do my best to respond. Just to say that this is one of the reasons why I'm ambivalent about the question of the presidential campaign. Congressional races, I'm not very ambivalent about. I just think they are 99, maybe 999 times out of 1,000 a waste of time for Greens. They just do not, they don't do anything for us. And I've worked on them. I've recruited people. And I could give some exceptions. I could give you the 1 out of 1,000 times that I think they're useful. But in terms of the presidential campaign, it's true that in some states it's only the presidential ticket that can function to get you ballot status. Which, for anybody who's paying attention doesn't already know, you can't run as a Green unless you have ballot status. And there are other states where it's one of a number of ways in which you can get ballot status. I also think it's very unlikely that the Greens will step back from running presidential tickets anytime soon. It would be a hard thing to make happen. In 2004, the Greens were under a lot of pressure from outside of the party to not run. And that was, as a co-chair at that time, quite frustrating to be experiencing that. But we were definitely going to run a candidate. That's where most Greens were at. And so I guess what I would say is, if the Greens are going to run presidential tickets, what kind of message is the presidential team putting forward, right? And I think that we have been effective around the Green New Deal and putting policy forward. But it would be kind of refreshing to see somebody really talk very explicitly about the fact that capitalism and democracy don't mix. And a living planet and capitalism don't mix. And beyond that, that our system of government is not one that makes a functional democracy possible, right? I mean, so if you're running for the White House, be clear that you're going to be pushing for a new constitution in this country, and that you're not seeking the presidency for yourself, right? And be campaigning on the green politics of green communities, of decentralization, and also of taking on the global question. So, I mean, I haven't thought this all out, right? But if I were advising somebody for the next cycle and they were going to run, I would tell them to stop the pretense that the Greens are going to win national power under this system of elections, and be able to administer the apparatus of government from Washington, D.C. I used to tell friends of mine in 2000 who were, self-identified anarchists and involved in the anarchist movement, who would say, "Oh, Ralph Nader, he's a sellout." And I'd say, "Do you really think that Ralph would be allowed to govern if he were to win the White House?" I mean, let's be real about the way in which power actually functions in this country. So we have to do a lot more base building. We have to do a lot more work at the bottom of society. And if we run presidentially, and if Greens run presidentially, they should probably be more honest about how we actually understand power to function in this country. And and I want to say I don't want to come off as dissing, as we would have said in the 90s, anybody who's run for a congressional office. There are a lot of great people who've run, but it's not, if you look at the history of Green campaigns, that's never been a place where we've been able to get a foothold.
But at least you get a message out when you do it, at least. So
You do, but I would argue that, for example, Ray Vogler, who was a leading peace activist in Wisconsin, who we ran against, Herb Kohl. We never ran against Russ Feingold. We always ran against Herb Kohl. We never ran against Tammy Baldwin, but we ran against Jim Doyle. So we picked the Democrats that we ran against, and it was always about having a clear difference. Ray Vogler was a great candidate, but I would argue that the work that Ray and other Greens did, many Greens, in putting the war on the ballot, was much more effective in terms of building the anti-war message than that U.S. Senate run. And the labor that was put in was a better, we got better value for it, just to be totally utilitarian about it.
okay, well, I think that it's time to close down this wonderful presentation, Ben. Thank you so much for your time and appearing and talking to us.
You bet. Yeah, thanks to you as well for inviting me.